Hi class. Our first textbook is called A History of Christian Education by John Elias. This is the text we will be discussing over the next 4 weeks. What follows here is a perusal of the main topics that will be covered. You are required to read the first 190 pages only. See the page allocations in the PowerPoint for the weekly readings. Today we will review the introduction to the book. In the introduction, Elias lays out the content of the 6 chapters we will be covering. The major influences on early Christian education were Hebrew, Greek, and Roman. The definitive instruction came from the teachings of Jesus, his disciples and apostles. The primary center of Christian teaching was Alexandria, Egypt, and the 2 primary catechists were Clement and Origen. They both incorporated classical paideia into Christian education. Paideia is instruction that produces a well-rounded, intelligent person. Augustine's writings are authoritative and extensive. Other key contributors during this time, the Middle Ages, are John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzen. A few decades after the Council of Nicaea in 325, Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzen combined the classical and biblical literature into a complex set of ideas and inspiration, which were taught in the catechetical schools of Alexandria, Antiochia, Edessa, and others. This followed once there was no longer just education for the parousia, which is the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now there was the reality that persons had to be educated for the secular occupations, and therefore they needed classical training as well. So what we saw in the Middle Ages was the main centers of Christian education being formed at the catechetical schools, where there was this amalgamation of Christian thinking, biblical text, and of classical literature. Other Middle Ages educators, Christian educators that is, include Alcuin, Bernard of Clairvaux, Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventure. The locations for Christian education were in monasteries, dioceses, parishes, and universities. The persistent tension between faith and reason will continue to plague religious educators until today. It is a war between the intellectual and spiritual, the rational and emotional. Christian education was a principal component of Renaissance humanism. The Italian Renaissance infused Greek and Latin teaching of literature and the arts. The Northern Renaissance in England and Holland was fostered by the writings of Erasmus, More, and Colet. These made a learned piety an integral part of Renaissance education. Protestant reformers integrated elements of this humanism into their proposals for reforming the Christian church and its education. Luther, Melanchthon, John Calvin, and Zwingli were the great educators of the Protestant Reformation. Both Martin Luther and John Calvin wrote catechisms that were extremely influential. As a counter-reformation, the Catholic Church began intensive educational efforts. Inspired by the Council of Trent, education was carried out primarily by religious orders of men and women, namely the Jesuits, the Brothers of the Christian Schools, and the Ursuline Sisters. Protestant education took place in Europe and the United States among Lutherans, Pietists, Reformed Calvinists, Anglicans, Puritans, Quakers, and Methodists. The greatest challenge to Christian education in the West came from the ideas on religion and education proposed by Enlightenment thinkers. The Enlightenment movement included atheism and deism, the belief that there is no God, and the belief that God exists but is not involved in the affairs of human beings. Many of the chief figures of the Enlightenment wrote about education, addressing religious education. These writers include Locke, Rousseau, and Helvetius. Other Enlightenment writers that we will discuss this semester include Wollstonecraft and Kant. Prominent educators included Johann Pestalozzi and Friedrich Froebel. Enlightenment ideas were essential factors in the establishment of national systems of education in Europe and in the United States. Bitter conflicts arose among competing religious groups as well as between religious groups and the state. Protestant education has undergone a number of significant shifts in the past 2 centuries. During the Great Awakening, evangelists such as Jonathan Edwards taught using highly emotional preaching. Harsh Bushnell pointed out the dangers in this approach and advocated a slower process of Christian nurture. With the advent of liberal Protestantism, the religious education movement, under the leadership of George Coe, and the newly founded Religious Education Association, made significant use of the social sciences and educational theory in promoting a more disciplined approach to education. In Neo-Orthodoxy, theology is the clue to religious education. The present situation is marked by a richness of theological and educational pluralism. This period has also witnessed what many call the secularization of Protestant higher education. The books listed here, Ulick's History of Religious Education, Duhavier's History of the Catechumenate, Brown's Augustine of Hippo, and Walker's History of the Christian Church, are recommended supplemental readings. You will find a depth of additional information on the topics that are covered throughout this course. Enjoy.